All right, everyone, welcome back to the afternoon. I hope you were able to enjoy some lunch or have a nice break, did what you need to do during that time. Our next program is going to begin with an opening reflection and will feature individual presentations from members of WashU faculty and staff who focus on specific histories, WashU and slavery, the 1904 World's Fair Filipino exhibition, and private school desegregation in the 20th century. We're going to give a few bios before we invite all of our presenters up here. So first, Dr. Geoff Ward, our first presenter, is an historical sociologist whose scholarship examines the racial politics of social control and pursuit of racial justice, historically and today, with a focus on racial violence, youth justice, and representative legal authority. In addition to research articles and essays, he is the author of The Black Child Savers, Racial Democracy and Juvenile Justice, an award-winning book on the rise, fall, and lasting remnants of Jim Crow juvenile justice. Current projects examine broader histories of racial violence, their legacies, and implications for redress. Ward is also a member of the Reparative Justice Coalition of St. Louis, a community-based organization working to commemorate and address legacies of racist violence in our region. Our second presenter is Ria Unson Sharon, a Filipino-American artist and independent researcher. She was born in Manila and immigrated to the United States in her teens. Unbeknownst to her, her great-grandfather was assigned to the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis during the American occupation of the Philippines. Her art practice is about imperialism and capitalism and their effects on migration and the evolution of identity and culture. Unson gives her talk, Filipinos at the 1904 World's Fair, A Legacy of Race and Empire, as part of the 2022 to 2024 Missouri Speakers Bureau. Her art is in the Missouri History Museum's permanent collection and in private collections in North America. At WashU, she is the Director of Digital Content Strategy in the Office of Marketing and Communications. She currently serves on the Danforth Staff Council and joins the University Libraries National Council in 2023.
Thank you, Stephen. Our third presenter is Dr. Michelle A. Purdy, Associate Professor of Education in Arts and Sciences, Director of Undergraduate Educational Studies, and Director of Academic Planning in the Department of Education. She is also an affiliated faculty member of the Department of African and African American Studies, the Interdisciplinary Program in Urban Studies, the Center on Urban Research and Public Policy, and the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity. Her specialties include the history of U.S. education, the history of African American education, the history of schools desegregation, and the history of policy access and opportunity. Her awards and recognition include the Washington University in St. Louis Arts and Sciences Excellence in Teaching Award, Outstanding Faculty Member Award from the Graduate Student Senate at Washington University in St. Louis, and a Spencer Foundation Dissertation Fellowship. Lastly, our moderator for this session, Dr. Kia Lily Caldwell, is the Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs and Diversity, Professor of African and African American Studies, and Dean's Distinguished Professorial Scholar in Arts and Sciences at Washington University in St. Louis. As Vice Provost, Kia fosters the development of equitable faculty policies and supports the professional development, thriving, and success of all Danforth campus faculty. Trained as a sociocultural anthropologist, her research has focused on race, gender, Black feminism, health policy, and HIV/AIDS in Brazil and the US. She is currently co-editing an anthology titled Black Feminisms Beyond Borders, Cultivating Knowledge, Solidarity, and Liberation, and completing a book titled Occupy Politics, Black Women's Democratic Engagement in the Americas. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kia Caldwell to the stage.
So thanks everyone. Thank you, Deanna and Stephen, for getting us started with this session. And it's an honor and a pleasure to moderate this important discussion about history. We wanted to start off with something interactive. We know we just had lunch, and to continue some of the things that Jacob started with us in terms of intergroup dialogue, We'd like for you to pair up or get into groups of about 3 people. And we have this question for you for us to consider for the next 15 minutes. And it is, how have the histories of St. Louis and of WashU shaped our here and where we are now as a university community? So, we won't be sharing out from this, so please feel free to make this a courageous space to share your reflections on this for the next few minutes. And then we'll start with our panel. Thanks. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to share your WashU stories and your St. Louis stories. We're going to have a chance to report out about something else later, so we do look forward to hearing from you. We just want to keep moving with our presentation, so I'm going to invite Professor Geoff Ward, my colleague in African and African American Studies, and also the director of the WashU and Slavery Project, up to give his presentation.
Thank you, Kia. I've been thinking about this question for a long time, the prompt. How has the history of St. Louis and of WashU shaped our here? And it's a big focus of the WashU and Slavery Project, which I'll talk about in a moment. But first, I just want to provide a little bit of context in terms of my own area of scholarship, which is on the study of historical racial violence, its haunting legacies, and the question of repair. I've been, for many years now, studying sort of the afterlives of structural racism, beginning with the study that was mentioned, the racial history of juvenile justice. But since then, been looking at histories of lynching and of enslavement. And what we know from that body of work is that societies essentially embody and reproduce histories of racialized violence. And we also believe, we being people who are doing work in this area, believe that in order to disembody the logics of racialized violence and the legacies that are numerous, I'll show some examples in a moment, we have to, as societies, process the historical trauma. We have to work through it and integrate it into who we are, how we understand where we are, how we relate to each other and to place. And as you all probably know, this nation and many other nations have resisted that challenge to face difficult truths and difficult pasts. I like how Tessa Moore Suzuki describes this predicament in her book, The Past Within Us. She describes a situation of implication where, though we are not ourselves responsible for the violent structures and institutions and webs of ideas, which include the idea of race itself, and we were not there, we did not do it, we did not ourselves enslave people and so forth. We are implicated in this, in these histories in the sense that they shape who we are and where we are, and the sort of the conditions of our lives. I'll give you an example of that. This is the cover of a recent special issue of the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science that I co-edited with a couple of other WashU faculty members, where we brought together a number of studies that look at legacies of racial violence. And the cover is a picture of the old jail in St. Louis from 1837, where there was a Close the Jail campaign, very similar to the Close the Workhouse campaign in modern times, and which also fell, unfortunately, on indifferent ears in the 19th century context, where people were, in this case, regulators were saying this jail is unsafe. People kept there are at risk, and it doesn't meet sort of minimal ethical standards for a kind of legal institutional complex. It is from this jail that a free black man named Francis McIntosh was abducted in 1836 by a white mob and burned alive, and in the area of what is now Keener Plaza. And there's a long story here that I won't drag you, I won't go through all of it, but the thing I want to emphasize about this story is that the mob enjoyed impunity. The mob, a grand jury was convened to investigate the case and refused to indict the perpetrators, in part because the judge, whose name was Lawless, his last name was Lawless, great name for a judge, Judge Luke Lawless, said that if we indict this mob, we will embolden the abolitionists. And so we have to extend impunity to the perpetrators of this racial terror. This is a moment in our history where there was a corruption of the rule of law. There are many, many such moments, but I just want you to just reflect on the fact that we still live with the debris of the corruption of the rule of law in our country. And it's through incidents like this that didn't create the problem, but they themselves embodied the moment and reproduced the contradictions of American democratic ideals, including the notion of equal protection. The other thing I want to mention about this, I'll come back to this figure in a moment, but that the person who was foreman of the grand jury was a man named John O'Fallon. You might have heard of him. His name is everywhere. John O'Fallon was also a founding trustee of WashU. Also, 10 years after this case, became the president of the Anti-Abolition Society of St. Louis, which fought to attempt to derail the abolitionist movement and failed, but did succeed in some ways, and for example, succeeded in lobbying for legislation that was passed by the Missouri legislature that prohibited the education of African Americans in 1846, just about 7 years before WashU was founded as a higher education institution in this very city. So these are histories that we're still, haunted by in some ways, and that we're working through. And this is working. Yeah. Let me show you some examples of. There's a large body of work now that demonstrates empirically that we remain haunted by histories of racialized violence. This map is showing you the percent of the population enslaved in 1860. The darker the shading, the higher the percentage enslaved. You can see Missouri up there, and that band across Missouri, across the middle there, is known still today as Little Dixie, the Little Dixie region of Missouri, settled by whites from border South states like Tennessee and Kentucky, many of whom would go on to be instrumental figures in WashU's history. But this study showed that the percent enslaved in 1860, this is a study in the Journal of Politics from just a few years ago, that the percent enslaved in 1860 predicts a number of subsequent outcomes. All of these outcomes are, I'm showing you the outcome, but also the direction of the relationship in the time period they're looking at in terms of these outcomes. Elevated rates of lynching, higher levels of opposition to liberal government candidates, liberal candidates for office, less support for affirmative action. In 2008, this is 1860 data predicting outcomes in 2008. All this is net of other factors. This is a complex multivariate analysis that's asking, net of all these other factors that might predict these outcomes, is the percent enslaved related statistically to these patterns? And they find that the effects are pronounced and consistent over generations of white Americans who live in these places compared to white counterparts in other places in the former slaveholding states, or compared to other counties with less dependence on enslavement in these in states where slavery was legal. I'll show you another example of a study. This is a study that looks at a phenomena that I sort of describe as medical estrangement. And, this is, many of you may remember, and maybe you're still dealing with hesitancy to take on the COVID vaccine. And my mother, who's an African-American woman from South Side of Chicago, frequently cited the Tuskegee experiment as a reason why she should not trust the government and pharmaceutical companies to inject a vaccine in her body. And it took a long time. Fortunately, she remained healthy, but it took a long time to talk her into, getting vaccinated because of the haunting legacy of the Tuskegee experiments. And this study looked at how the revelation of the Tuskegee study in 1972 related to healthcare utilization among African-American men. And the range, I don't know how well you can see the light blue shading around the mean there, but the range is capturing the magnitude of the effect relative to distance from Tuskegee. what they found in this study was that the closer you live to Tuskegee, the more profound the impact was on healthcare utilization. So this is, there are many examples of such studies, and in the interest of time, I'm going to just kind of quickly go through a list of what we've seen in this work. One of the most consistently demonstrated results is related to is Black victim homicide being predicted by histories of racist violence, in particular lynching. And here the argument is similar to the medical estrangement argument. I mean, one of the things that scholars believe is at work there is a history of legal estrangement, where African-American populations have learned that they cannot trust the state to adjudicate their grievances because the state is often implicated directly in the perpetration of racist violence historically, and always implicated in the withholding of legal protection, whether through prevention or through the criminal punishment of perpetrators, i.e. in the case of Frances McIntosh. And so in that context, the belief is people engage in essentially self-help strategies with regard to resolving conflict. And in a society where there's easy access to lethal weapons, this can translate into high rates of lethal violence. Now, again, this is a story about patterns in specific, kind of what I've written about elsewhere as microclimates of racial meaning. These are places, very specific places like St. Louis, that are shaped by their specific histories of racialized violence. And this is just an example, a sample of some of the many studies that have looked at these relationships. So when I came to WashU in 2018, I had been doing this basic research for a while, and I was very interested in the question of translation. What do we do with this knowledge? How do we use it to achieve what I was calling earlier the disembodiment, the disinheritance of these haunting legacies? And this is one of the reasons we decided, as a university, joined the Global Consortium of Universities Studying Slavery a couple of years ago. This is John O'Fallon, who I mentioned. This is his big house that is in the area of College Hill today, and was in the area of College Hill near Bellefontaine Cemetery and so forth. But through WashU and Slavery, we have a number of aims, and one is to revisit our foundational story. What is the story? What is the backstory of WashU? And you may know, until relatively recently, there was a kind of very limited story about that. It was a sort of a happy story about William Greenleaf Eliot being on the good side of history, which turned out to be an exaggeration of his abolitionist inclinations. He was, like many white Missourians, in favor of ending slavery, but by no means invested in a notion of of human and civil rights or of equality. His anti-Black racism was pronounced, which was common among the mainstream of abolitionists. But we're also looking at other foundational figures like John O'Fallon and many others. I think that the sort of important parts of important parts of this project relate to what this work can do for us as an institution in terms of repositioning our institution in this community in terms of its relationship to St. Louis and the broader region, and ultimately the global communities we're connected with. Recently, there was a visiting scholar named Devarian Baldwin talking about his book, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, which is very much about universities as landowners, as health system, controllers, as police forces and so forth. But in addition to all that, there is the whole history of the humanities and the social sciences at our institutions, and out of which come a great deal of inhumanity and rationalization of things like urban renewal or redlining or the withholding of equal protection under law. So we have to reckon with those, I think, in terms of our repositioning to build trust and cooperation, relationships of trust and cooperation in our local and global communities. And I think this will be, we think this will be of great benefit to our our students, and in particular, who are, wherever they're going next, if maybe some of them are staying here, but wherever they're going next, they will be somewhere that is dealing with these kinds of questions. The legacies of colonialism, of slavery, are among the world's most pressing problems. So we think this initiative can be helpful in preparing our students and others to engage that. We've done a number of things through WashU and slavery, and there's not enough time to kind of go through a full description, but I do want to invite you to go to our website, slavery.wustl.edu, and you'll find things there like this searchable database, which Carl Craver, professor in philosophy, and a number of students and others have, we're working with the Humanities Digital Workshop, built this tool that essentially digitizes records of slave ownership from historical censuses, and allows you to easily go in and stick a name in like O'Fallon, out of which will come, and you get results saying, all the places O'Fallon shows up, then John O'Fallon and other O'Fallons show up, and the records of slave ownership and so forth. This has been very useful, not only for our research, but also for community partners who've been interested in researching things like the namesakes of their schools or streets, and this tool is helpful there. We've done things like create exhibitions in partnership with the libraries here, where we've introduced some of the research creatively, such as through these what I think of as mugshots, where we've overlaid the fine art portraiture of these foundational figures, Wayman Crowe, Henry Shaw, and John O'Fallon, with the slave ownership schedules from the census that document their history as enslavers. And I call them mugshots. I used to be in a criminology department, and I used to teach an article about, but there's a really good article about the punitive visual aesthetics of mugshots. And so part of what we were exploring here was how to kind of reorient notions of dignity, and who's deserving of our dignity, and who should we recognize as being flawed. The fine art portraiture kind of washes away, So anyway, I love these. It was great to work with the folks in the library on that. This is a map, of the where we are now. This is Skinker, and this is Forsyth, and these shaded areas are places we know people were enslaved. Enslaved by the Forsyth family, the Skinker family, the Hanleys, the Clayton family. This is an incomplete story, but this is part of what we've been working on with WashU and slavery, is documenting the landscape backstory. One of the things most interesting to me about this is that at least part of the South 40 sits on what was formerly the Forsyth family farm plantation. This, by the way, goes all the way to, for those of you who are familiar with St. Louis and Forest Park, this land went all the way basically to the Muni in Forest Park. Massive tract of land. So what do we do with that information? And what do we do with the Wayman Crowe residential community, the namesake of this student housing community on the South 40? How should the burning kumquat garden on this landscape recognize this history, if at all? And the thing I'm, as an educator, I'm most interested in here is, how do we activate this history, this story, in ways that align with our pedagogical mission as an institution of higher education? There's a whole history of the medical school that I will just kind of quickly pass over here. But, this is I've talked already about medical estrangement, and when WashU's and St. Louis's history of medicine is bound up with that in significant ways. One thing that may be surprising to you is that WashU in its early history did admit small numbers of African-American students up until around 1890. And then up until the mid-1880s. And then by the late 1880s, there was this seemingly pronounced embrace of a kind of normative anti-Blackness that's represented not only in the exclusion of Black African-American students, albeit while other non-white students are being admitted still in small numbers, there's this exclusion of Black students, but it's also reflected in the material culture of the university. These are pictures from the 1903 yearbook that have these racist caricatures in them that are literally, marketing. This is a sort of example of racial capitalism, where the university is marketing anti-Blackness as a way of signaling its distinction as a white institution. It had previously, though, admitted, particularly in the law school, admitted African-American students, including the first Black lawyer to argue before the Missouri Supreme Court, was a WashU alum from the 1880s. This cartoon, we don't know the exact date of it, but the title at the bottom is "These Strangers at Our Gate," and it's a riff on a famous cartoon about U.S. Contradictory immigration laws. The U.S. claiming to be, welcoming of immigrants and yet excluding people on the basis of race, ethnicity. So it says here, there are all these names of folks up here, of nations and ethnic groups, Chinese, Indian, Japanese, Mexican, Filipino, Egyptian, Puerto Rican, which is, interesting. The old trees that used to be there. And it says students from everywhere under the sun save colored American citizens. And they're just sort of looking longingly. We think this is from the 1950s. So, in terms of the prompt that that preceded this, one of the things that has shaped our where we are in St. Louis and our own institution is this history of anti-Blackness. We don't know the exact number of Black graduates at this point, but we think the number is fewer than 10 in the first 100 years of WashU's history. If you think about institutions of higher education as social mobility engines, think about how generations of not only Americans and St. Louisans, but people from around the world have differentially had access to opportunities for mobility vis-a-vis higher education at this institution, and others, of course, over the span of time. The legacy of that is everywhere around us, including in things like the profound and seemingly intractable racial wealth gap in our nation. So I'm going to stop with just an invitation for people to get involved with the WashU and Slavery Project. You can go to our website. You can reach out to me directly if you would like. I want to give you one last example of the kind of things we're doing, and I'm going to turn it over to Rhea Unson. But just this week, we organized the second iteration of the Black Geography's River Tour, which is countering the erasure of Black and Indigenous histories of the river by literally putting them on the map. This is a map I made to facilitate the tour. The tour included WashU students and faculty, but also community partners. And here's a picture of us coming back into the city. But what I loved about this most was that our community partners, both Big Muddy Adventures, and also members of indigenous nations who were part of our group, really embraced the map as something they could share, as a resource they could pass, that they could incorporate into their own tours and so forth. And so this is the kind of thing we think we can be doing through WashU and Slavery. I mentioned before this idea of repositioning our relationship. And we're hopeful that will continue over the years to come. Finally, with WashU and Slavery, we've focused on the first 50 years of our institutional history because it takes us from 1853 roughly to the World's Fair 1904, which is this really pivotal moment in our institutional history. It's when we move from downtown to the Danforth campus. It's when we move from this somewhat more inclusive model to a model of anti-Blackness and selectivity that's partially racialized as a sort of quest for distinction and so forth. But the World's Fair itself is this really pivotal moment, and not only for our university, but for our city. And Rhea's going to talk more about this, but I just want to mention one thing about the World's Fair, which is that not only is our institution implicated in things like the anthropology days and the racist pseudoscience of the Olympic Games that were played on our campus, but we also extracted a great deal of capital from leasing the land and property. But the World's Fair itself was a major educational event. It was the first World's Fair to prioritize education. So it organized groups, thousands of school children came with their teachers to study the exhibitions, the sites of the World's Fair. It was touted as this sort of, introduction to the world. And it was a very racialized, sort of imperialist orientation to the world that, again, has a legacy that we're still grappling with today. So I'll stop there and pass it on to my colleague Ria to say more about the 1904 fair.
Thank you so much for that seamless transition, Geoff. In addition to my role on staff in the Office of Marketing and Communications, I am an independent researcher and a mixed media artist. And like Stephen mentioned, I was born in Manila, which is the capital of the Philippines, but I've spent almost 30 years here in St. Louis. So I like to think of my art practice as a way to archive my research as well as my lived experience as an immigrant and post-colonial subject. The focus of my work is actually, let me just change the slides here. The focus of my work centers portions of American history and Filipino history that have been intentionally erased or misrepresented or sometimes forgotten and excluded. Through my research in art, I've been better able to understand my experience as a Filipino American in the sense that the life that I live today, that I thought was the result of a series of independent choices made by me, it turns out is a legacy of events that happened here in St. Louis over 100 years ago, so specifically the World's Fair. And that's what I'm going to share with you, my story. So just a heads up, if you have feelings about the fair, those might change. My current exhibition is at the Millstone Gallery at COCA, so the Center for Creative Arts, and this is one example of how I look back on that event and examine how it continues to make an impact today. I have 3 multimedia installations as part of that show that combine portraits of present-day Filipinos from the St. Louis community, and on those portraits, I project images that were taken during the fair, just to illustrate how perceptions of Filipino Americans continue to be distorted by the past. So I first became interested in this subject when I discovered just a few years ago, quite by accident, that my great-grandfather was brought to St. Louis as one of 1,200 Filipinos for the fair. So this is him standing on the steps of Festival Hall. On this World's Fair map, you can see where the Filipino exhibit is situated and then also where the Danforth campus is now. The map is actually oriented with south facing up, so we have to zoom in and flip it in order to line it up with this Google map from today. So you can see Skinker that borders Forest Park on the right and DeMunn Avenue and then Wydown Boulevard. The arrow is pointing out Wydown Terrace, which is on the National Register of Historic Places. Back in 1904, it was actually Arrowhead Lake, which bordered the Philippine Reservation. By doing this overlay a few years ago, I discovered that not only my great-grandfather and I were in the same city, but we actually were in the same places. I lived in this area that now occupies the land where the Philippine Village once stood. My kids actually went to the school that sits on the land. So I spent a lot of time walking this land, and maybe some of you have too, since it's right across from campus. You can see there the southeast corner of the 40. The Philippine exhibit is most well known for putting on display 40 tribes of indigenous people from the Philippines. It was called a human zoo. And according to David Francis, that is the David Francis of Francis Field, who was president of the World's Fair Commission, 99% of fair attendees went to the Philippine Village. So the exhibit spanned 47 acres. It was basically the largest and most popular exhibit at the fair. And when people were asked about the fair decades later, the anthropology exhibits were the things that they first remembered. I have an hour-long presentation about that provides more historical context for the fair, but basically it came on the heels of the mostly forgotten Philippine-American War. That was 1899 to 1902, and the American occupation that followed, which, by the way, lasted for almost half a century. In that presentation, I go over why it was really important to the powers that be that the fair includes such an extensive exhibit on the Philippines, and that was to sway public opinion regarding the war and the occupation. Because 1902, 1903, so the years leading up to the fair, the concept of America as an empire was really contentious and there was a lot of public outcry against it. But in the interest of time, I have boiled it down to just a few slides. So during the Philippine-American War, rice production dropped by 75%. 90% of the carabaos were wiped out. These are the water buffalo that are the backbone of farming in the Philippines. And over the course of the occupation, over 1 million Filipinos died from combat and imprisonment, resettlement, starvation, and disease. So that was 1/8 of the country's population. I'm also going to just let the fair organizers speak for themselves. First, William Taft argued, so he was the future US president, but at the time he was the Governor General of the Philippines. He said that the fair would exert a very great influence in completing the pacification of the Philippines by creating a cadre of Filipinos that would be informed about the wonders of modern civilization and overawed by its inexorability. So Walter Johnson of Harvard claims that the Philippine reservation was essentially an act of psychological warfare. And then there's David Francis, again, who said that the exhibits at the fair were explicitly designed to teach the working citizenry of the United States about the proper classification, correlation, and harmonization of capital and labor. So it was about capitalism as a form of racial progress. This is from Matthew Jacobson at Yale. And finally, we have William McGee, who is the head of the anthropology department at the fair, who said that the exhibits were to use living peoples in their accustomed avocations as our great object lesson, to represent human progress from the dark prime to the highest enlightenment. So from all these sources, their intentions were made clear. We also have a 38-page document written by Governor General Taft on information and instructions on the preparation of the Philippine exhibit. So now we're going to look at how the fair organizers executed their plans. The fairgrounds were designed very intentionally. Going back to the map here, remember that this is where the Philippine exhibit is situated and that it sits right behind the Palace of Agriculture. So there was no way to get here without going through the rest of the fairgrounds first. Here are the entrances to the fair. You remember how that map had south facing up? That was because this is where the train station is, which means that most fairgoers would be deposited at that entrance and proceed up towards the Cascades. So this would be their first vista, which would have been Festival Hall and the Cascades, which is now Art Hill and the Art Museum. That's the Art Museum, just to give you some sense of scale. And Festival Hall sat on what is now Art Hill. So their first vista, their first vista would have been of that enormous building on Art Hill. And then they would have had to walk around the Palace of Agriculture. They were actually called palaces, by the way. The word palace comes from a Latin root meaning house of power, or literally house of the emperor. So around the palace and across a replica of the Bridge of Spain over Arrowhead Lake. And this is what they would see when they're in the Philippine reservation. So they'd see straw huts across a moat that separated the village from the palace. The optics are pretty striking. But what a fairgoer couldn't experience was that 10,000 laborers, it took them over 2 years to construct those palaces, while the Filipinos had to build their shelters with materials they brought with them in less than a month. So I don't like to show these images without showing the following slides too, because in addition to the tribal villages, the Philippines also had cities like Manila, where I'm from. So this is what that looked like in 1899. And you can see down at the bottom, there's the date printed right on the stereograph. But this was not what the fair organizers wanted attendees to remember, because these images don't really support the narrative of the Philippines being an uncivilized country that needed to be lifted up from savagery. This is, culture, the inside of a theater. And just glimpses of what the actual world, the actual country was that the US invaded. This same intended narrative was made explicit in the brochures and the guidebooks. So these are still in circulation. You can find some of them on eBay. They have vivid written descriptions of the Igorots, who essentially came to stand in for all Filipinos in American cultural memory. Igorots, headhunters and dog eaters from Uncle Sam's Island domain, the pagan, barbarian culture. And finally, that story was illustrated with carefully curated images. So there are a lot of anthropological images at the fair. This one of a man named Ibag was labeled the missing link #1, and until fairly recently was on display at the History Museum's World Fair exhibit. So back to my own family history. How did my great-grandfather come to be here and part of this exhibit? Ramon Ochoa was in the inaugural class of the Pensionado program, which was a scholarship established by Taft, where 100 16 to 17-year-old boys were selected by examination and sent to American universities with the intention of them finishing college here and then after graduation going back to the colony and filling civil positions. But for this first inaugural class, their first assignment was to work as guides and waiters at the fair. And the purpose of this was not just for the logistics of needing the labor to do these jobs, but again for the optics, because in contrast to the native people who were primitives and savages, here was a group that was visibly westernized, and it was to prove at how easily the local population could be civilized, and how the American presence in the Philippines had already improved their lives. So they were seen wearing Western suits, they spoke perfect English, and these pensionados eventually would go back to the Philippines and become Supreme Court justices and politicians and secretaries of various departments, a founder of a university. So in part through their influence, within one generation, Philippine society became a replica of America. My great-grandfather, Ramon, did in fact go back to the Philippines informed of the wonders of Western civilization as Taft intended, and he rose through the ranks of the Philippine Constabulary and actually fought alongside American troops against Filipino insurgents. So I grew up with this portrait of him in our living room. It is the last surviving image of him after World War II, until I discovered that one picture in 2018. He named his daughter, so my grandmother, Daisy, which is not a typical Filipino name. She spoke with an American accent, although she lived her entire life in the Philippines. She chose to study English in college, and she would often remind me of how lucky we were that we were the only Asian country who spoke English. Daisy would marry Miguel, who went by Mike because he got his graduate degree from MIT. And then 2 of their children would also come to the US. One went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and one went to Stanford. So when it came time for me, I chose to go too. So you see how the path to my American education was paved with generational precedents. I'm 4th generation educated here. My choice seemed like the most natural one in the world, but notably my half-sisters on my mom's side who don't share Ramon's lineage had no inclination to come here. What I did not anticipate was that I would be received or perceived any differently than anyone else in America. Because my experience in the Philippines was as an extension of the US. We watched American TV shows. I ate Pop-Tarts. There was McDonald's every other corner. We spoke English at home and at school. And I found a quote in the Manila Times from 1908, written by a newspaper editor from Missouri, who said that Manila is the most thoroughly American city I've ever visited outside the United States. So, learning all of this history, I became really interested in memory and what is remembered and what is forgotten, what is left behind, what is brought forward, and how does that shape the future? Because when I landed in Madison, Wisconsin in 1985, that was 81 years post-fair, the most common questions I got from my fellow 13-year-old high school classmates is, do you eat dogs? And did you live in a tree? And I was so taken aback by these questions because we didn't know about the fair back in Manila. This is my neighborhood in Manila. My house is just off the bottom slide of this picture. You can see how I would be confused by these questions. Down at the bottom there, this dark building, that is where I took art lessons, and that's where I learned to paint most summers of my childhood. So decades later, I went to the History Museum archives on Skinker, and I held in my hands those brochures from 1904, and I read those exact phrases. And I realized that just as my great-grandfather had been here, that my classmates' ancestors were probably here as well. And Geoff was just talking about, what a big educational push the fair was. And those impactful firsthand experiences they had were perpetuated through every book and article and commemorative spoon about the World's Fair since then. So these stories about Filipinos endured 4 generations to confront me, who in the 80s at Monona Grove High School was the first and only Filipino they'd ever met. And that is what began my assimilation. Although unconscious, I see now how hard I worked to convince everybody else that I was not a dog-eating savage who lived in a tree. My friends were all white. I eventually settled here with my white ex-husband. I have a whole collection of painted books because I was interested in how language and books and education were used to colonize. So I picked specific books to address different themes. This self-portrait that I chose to do on Tarzan, because the book is all about taming the beast and a Tarzan struggle to find belonging. So on the recto page, I ghost out a childhood picture of myself as a way to symbolize that whitewashing that you saw in the previous slide. I use physical books as a launching off point. I build counter narratives to rewrite these stories as a way to reclaim agency around my story. This one is Gulliver's Travels, clearly about colonization. It was by Jonathan Swift, who is from Britain's first colony, and I chose a snapshot of me with my grandparents in London. I also emphasize certain pages of the text so that the page now tells a different story. And finally, this is the Wizard of Oz. So I chose to paint it on the pages where Dorothy confronts the wizard and he says, "I'm just a guy from Nebraska." And these people in the strange faraway place that I'd landed in thought I was a god. So I got to tell them to build the Emerald City because they were afraid of me. So I added Brookings Hall because it was, after all, the administration building of the World's Fair. And the leasing it to the Fair Commission helped finance the construction of this campus. So right after I finished the piece, I found this article that L. Frank Baum The Wizard of Oz is actually about the Philippines and in the context of the Spanish-American War. And so I was telling my sister, who's in this portrait, and she's like, "We're the Lollipop Kids." And I dressed up like Glinda. That is the problem. The machinations of Taft, McKinley, and Francis, that is how you end up with a person who looks like me, who talks like this, who lives here, and makes my livelihood out of promoting American higher education. I am a construction. But as Professor Ward said earlier, they cause us, like maybe we're all constructions. that is the story of how I got to here. And this is why I continue to believe in our mission as an institution of higher education, because I'm proof of its power. Education not only shaped my family, but it changed the course of history for an entire generation. So, just like at that turn of the century, we are at another inflection point. We get to decide collectively what's next. And that would be my call to you as a community at an elite educational institution. And something to think about is that these conversations, as they continue to happen, I'm living proof that whatever we decide can have ripple effects beyond our lifetimes that could shape at least the next 5 generations. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Michelle Purdy, who is an expert on many things, but especially on the history of U.S. education and the history of education here at WashU.
Great job, Rhea. I love how Rhea is old school with the note cards, so that's inspiring. So, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all are doing well. First, a special thanks to all those involved in the planning and execution of today's event, and a special note of gratitude to Sarah Murphy, who invited me to present today. I am not just a professor here at WashU. 25 years ago, I was finishing my first year of undergrad. This actually could be close to the day after we went to the Lauryn Hill concert. She was scheduled to come in March, and then she postponed, but we had an epic time in April of 1998, and Outkast opened for her, if you can guess that. That's how big Lauryn Hill, well, it would have been 99, sorry, would have been 99 that she performed with the album dropping in September of 98. So yeah, 25 years I've been affiliated with WashU. Born and raised in Jackson, Mississippi, to parents born into the Jim Crow South, to a grandmothers, I should say, who taught in segregated Black schools, not far removed from the enslavement generation. And so me being a professor here was not necessarily a part of our family's trajectory. Dean McLeod, one of my champions, used to say, education can be transformative. And indeed, my 25 years affiliated with WashU, first as an undergrad from 97 to 01, who majored in educational studies and African-American studies with a minor in music, who stayed and did her master's in history, who took a break and went home to Jackson and worked at the elite private school that she attended growing up, who then went to Emory for her PhD, worked at Michigan State for 2 years as a faculty member, and is now finishing her 10th year on faculty here at WashU, was not necessarily common to my Black family from Jackson, Mississippi. So part of what we're going to talk about today is how Black undergraduate student life has challenged and changed WashU's culture. I'm no longer active with the implementation of Here and Next, but I did appreciate the opportunity to be a part of the early undergraduate working group. I think that was either summer 20 or 21, led by Jen Smith and Jay Turner, that included a group of faculty and staff and students that genuinely engaged in how to make the undergraduate experience better and more equitable here at WashU. My talk today is rooted in what I know about Black educational history and builds on what I consider to be the central elements of understanding history. Sophie is here, one of my former students. She knows what I'm about to talk about in terms of the tenets of what I teach my students, with thinking about how do we understand history with an eye towards what history can teach us about today. So this is my work is always anchored in deep understanding of context, cause, and chronology, the 3 C's of history that I learned from the late Professor Leslie Brown, who was in the history department here back in the day, layered with understanding policies, practices, and beliefs. And so if we think about Geoff and Rhea's talks, Geoff's talks focuses on the mid to late 19th century. Not only did the court say that in the Dred Scott case that Black people had no rights that the court had to abide, but that was also the 50s and 60s, 1850s and 60s, in addition to the outlawing of Black folks being able to read and write, was the beginning of scientific racism. And scientists' work were bought by the federal government to sustain and to say that Black folks, yes, you are inferior. Fast forward, 1896, post-Civil War, Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court says, yeah, that 14th Amendment doesn't really apply to social customs. So we can have separate but equal. And then 1904, we get the World's Fair, less than 10 years after Plessy, and we see the ways in which the U.S.'s manifest destiny beliefs about itself and the inferiority beliefs about others play out in the World's Fair. And such beliefs about the inferiority of others would play out not just with Black people, but the European immigrants that came in mass in the 1910s and 20s. We see that how it played out in standardized tests in the beginning of IQ tests in the 1910s and 20s, which undergirds a lot of educational research, undergirded by beliefs about the inferiority of the other. So as Black students coming to a place like WashU that only enrolled a handful of us prior to what, Geoff? 1869, that didn't enroll any of us until the late 1940s, is a product of state-sanctioned racism, as well as the belief in the inferiority of Black individuals. And that was pretty much told to me as I have worked on some of this work. So as a first-year student, I was fortunate. I came here in 1997. ABS, the Association of Black Students, was on fire. Leaders like Robin Terry, Donna Lissa Fisher, who we call DC, Stephanie Baker, and I could go on, they were ready to celebrate and honor 30 years of the Association of Black Students. But they said, we're just not going to honor it. We're just not going to talk about it. Y'all going to learn some history to us underclass students. So they took us under our wings in multiple ways, but they made us learn the history of the Association of Black Students. We studied the first action proposal, the first Black manifesto written in 1968, and I'll give more context to that, in order that we could revisit it and write our own action proposal to discuss with the university what it had done in 30 years with respect to Black studies, Black faculty, Black students, Black student financial aid. So if you can imagine, the first time I met Chancellor Wrighton was actually across from a table for him as somebody who I probably never thought I would be, and that was a student activist, because of the work we did with the 97-98 action proposal. My learning about WashU would continue in 2007 as I researched and wrote the second part of the history of the John B. Irvin Scholars Program here at WashU. And then my work continues to be anchored in my scholarly work in Black educational history that is detailed in an edited volume using past as prologue, and then my first solo authored book, Transforming the Elite, Black Students in the Desegregation of Private Schools, which looks at how and why elite K-12 private schools decided to desegregate when legally not obligated to do so, and how Black students navigated those spaces in the 1960s. So, with that being said, the history of Black undergraduate life here at WashU is enveloped by larger political, social, cultural, and historical forces and factors, as well as personal and community experiences that Black students bring with them, as I discussed in my first book, in their backpacks. I still carry a backpack, right? And there are a lot of things in that backpack that people can see, but there are a lot of things that people can't see. And that is what every student brings with them. But we know in the case of Black students, we carry the legacies of enslavement and Jim Crow and the continued manifestations of systemic racism. Today is just a beginning to considering how the Black students here at WashU have challenged and changed WashU culture, as we have contended with known and unknown backlash on campus and in the larger society, and as we developed as young adults. In my book, I discuss how the first Black students at Westminster and Atlanta exhibited what I termed courageous navigation in order to navigate institutional and interpersonal racism. Indeed, such courageous navigation is evident here at WashU as students countered interpersonal and institutional racism, as well as, I would say, courageous exploration of all this place that this could afford to us. I certainly could go deeper doing an intersectional analysis that considers the multiplicity of our identities, The Black undergraduate community is not a monolith, never has been, never will be. We didn't all have the same experiences here. We certainly do not all agree, even to this day. But by foregrounding race, we can begin to engage a fully more complicated institutional history about how we arrived here today and what we will do next. So I'm just going to go through a few slides in terms of thinking about how Black students have changed and challenged WashU. And so kind of bringing us up to the mid-20th century, I mentioned Plessy. We know that St. Louis is a segregated city. Missouri is a segregated state. Sumner gets founded as the first Black high school west of the Mississippi. Vashon is next in the early 20th century. Harris-Stowe, which we now consider our premier historically Black college and university here in St. Louis, was separated. And it's in the 1940s, the late 1940s, that WashU gets pushed to begin to desegregate over questions of tax exemption status. So the School of Medicine, Social Work, the graduate school, they opened their admissions to Black students in the late 1940s. By 1952, the undergraduate population is desegregated. Brown versus Board of Education, as we know, which overturns Plessy, happens in 1954. And then we obviously know from mid-50s, mid-60s, we have the Civil Rights Movement. Civil Rights Act of 64 is passed, Voting Rights Act, the Higher Education Act of 65, as well as of calls for affirmative action. But then with the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., higher education, in particular PWIs, are pushed in unique ways by their Black students. The universities also begin to see the need for more Black administrators. Dr. John B. Irvin begins as the first Black dean here at WashU as the dean of the School of Continuing Education, which is now University College. In 1968, which this is a picture of, Black students protest in Brookings for 9 days and issue the first Black manifesto, calling for Black studies, more Black students, more financial aid, better support of Black workers and staff, and more. And the Association of Black Collegians becomes the Association of Black Students. The 1970s and 80s is on a larger scale. You can think of Title IX. We can obviously think of the war on drugs and the beginning of the HIV and AIDS pandemic. And as Black students, they are bringing that all with them as AFAS also begins as a program. And it is through AFAS that traditions such as the Black Arts and Sciences Festival begins, the Martin Luther King Symposium, Black Honors and Awards, and the Black Graduate Student Luncheon. James E. McLeod, known to many as D. McLeod, joins the WashU faculty in the German department in 1974. We revisit the Black Manifesto in 1978. The Black Alumni Council is formed in the May of 1983. But we find ourselves with very low enrollment numbers of Black students by 1986. And per WashU style, a student raises the concern. Stephanie Lewis, who was then ABS president, goes to D. McLeod, talks to Chancellor Danforth, like, what are we going to do about the fact that we have such low enrollment numbers of Black students? And they began to brainstorm, how can we do better about recruiting Black students? And the John B. Irvin Scholars Program, then for Black Americans only, was founded with the first class beginning in 1987. The 1990s and 2000s, the Black life on campus really begins to take off. And as Sharon Stahl told me, who was a former dean here, when I interviewed her for the history of Irvin, she said, as quiet as it's kept, Michelle, Black students began to change white faculty and staff members' minds about Black students' capabilities. We get our first Rhodes Scholar in the early 1990s, Dr. Trina Williams-Shanks, who's now on faculty at the University of Michigan. The Mellon Minority Undergraduate Fellowship begins in 1993, which is now the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program, a program designed to increase the number of underrepresented minorities in the academy. As I mentioned, my story starts here, 1997, when we are celebrating, honoring 30 years of the Association of Black Students. And these are pictures from our commemorative march in the spring of 1998. One of my favorite, Dean McLeod, saying Jim supports ABS. We have Chancellor Danforth out there with us, Robin Terry, then our president, speaking on the steps of Brookings. The action proposal is one in which we call to say, hey, this is what we will do as students. We were working in the admissions office. We were working with alumni and development. We were doing all we could to help the university recruit Black students. We were also excelling academically in all phases of academics. and we were active with every part of campus life. In some ways, I think I don't know if we never sat down and said, we're gonna make it our mission to desegregate every campus group on this campus, but because some of it had already started, but we certainly pushed hard to be in higher positions in student union. I did not realize what it meant to be the first Black woman student body president here in 2000. We pushed hard to have more Black students in lock and chain. Today, I don't know, we have more sensitivities around what it means to wear a lock and chain around our necks. I don't know if we would do that as much today, but it was a sophomore honorary. We said we should be a part of it in greater number. We should be a part of 13 honorary, who now my students, they have their attacks on 13. We said we should be a part of 13 in greater numbers. And the list goes on and on. We also did a lot of dialogues just like this around race. We had Black women, Jewish women. We did days of dialogues. I can't see that, Trish. Days of dialogues and discovery similar to this as well. We also learned about St. Louis on our own. I think our lives were different. We were talking about kind of stories of family. It was here in St. Louis that I got very close to my mother's first cousin, Cousin Polly. She lived right over here on Melrose in U City. She had moved up here from the Delta. I never knew who Cousin Polly was growing up. I just knew her mother made amazing baked goods that she would send to us from Greenville, Mississippi. But Cousin Polly and her husband, Daddy, who we call Daddy James, they're both deceased now, they took me and my friends under their wings, right? If I needed a ride, they were there. If I wanted them to come to a program, they came. I learned about Black life in St. Louis from where I got my hair done on Union. I learned by going to Vashon High School, and I wrote about this in the fall, when the Black students wouldn't come over to the WashU table. I said, well, there's something really interesting going on here. Because WashU is great to me, but clearly not to the Black students at Vashon who never came to the campus college fair table. I learned about St. Louis through the eyes of the young Black girls that I would tutor at the Phyllis Wheatley Wide Sluice campus. I'll never forget, one day this rap song came on about I Miss My Homies. I said, why do you know every word? This young girl, she was like 10 years old, I said, why do you know every word to this song? She said, it reminds me of a relative I saw got shot in our yard, Michelle. That was part of their reality. It's not their only reality here in St. Louis, right? But for many of us, we learned about the pearls and the problems and the promise of St. Louis through family that lived here, through where we got our hair done or got our hair cut, through Black Greek life. For us to be, if you're a member of a historically Black sorority or fraternity in St. Louis, that means you're part of a citywide chapter. So I had sorors or sorority sisters in Alpha Kappa Alpha from University of Missouri, St. Louis, Harris Stowe, Fontbonne, Webster, and we were going around St. Louis. We had a different experience, I think. We were also very weary of the police. We knew that when the police came to predominantly Black parties, it felt different than when we were at our white friends' parties when the police came. Or when people got stopped just running in Clayton. Young men would get stopped running in Clayton by the police. I live in Clayton today. Guess what? If I go walking on Y Down, I'm still wearing a WashU in St. Louis t-shirt, right? So the 90s and 2000s, but also it was just a fabulous time, I will have to say. Like, was it perfect? No. Are there still issues people are working out? Probably so. But it was a beautiful time on this campus for Black students. We also, after I graduated, Black Students United with others to continue to support workers on campus. Another sit-in took place in Brookings. I'll finish up quickly, bringing us up to the present, the 2010s and 2020s. So I come back in 2013. As a faculty member, there's continued Black excellence and advocacy. By this time, the Urban program is for all students due to the Gratz and Grutter decisions and the pushback from the right on race-based minority scholarship programs. Clearly, if you were here in 2014, you saw the activism of our Black students and many other students in racial solidarity as they protested around this campus and in St. Louis the deaths of Michael Brown and Eric Garner. AFAS, as we have been hoping, becomes a department in 2017, right? We can tenure faculty in AFAS. WashU Black, So we still have organizations that are beginning, right? We had never had an organization for Black student athletes. And one of my mentees, Kara Watson-Haynes, begins WashU Black in 2020. By now, we have an all-time high percentage of undergraduate Black students. I think we're around 12 to 13%. We have a multiplicity of Black student organizations, including the African Student Association in Queens. We have traditions, though, such as Black Anthology that continues, as well as the McLeod Honors, and that will happen Monday when we honor Black students on campus. This past fall, we celebrated 35 years of the John B. Irvin program. Thank you. And we brought back alumni such as Brittany Packnett-Cunningham and Morgan DeBond to campus. So what is next? What is next? So this fall, we will celebrate 30 years of the Mellon Mays Fellowship Program and 40 years of the Black Alumni Council. For the first time, and we've been asking for it for a while, we're going to have a first ever Black Alumni Council reunion weekend in October. Imani Cheers here, which is, I guess will be on you all's right, is largely responsible for that. She's our BAC chair for the DC area. We have events like this one that's happening in June, a virtual event among Imani, Dr. Crystal Moten, whose new book just dropped, and Dr. Kiana Irvin, who earned her PhD here. We have to continue. This morning, the panel talked about hard questions we have to keep asking. So we have to ask ourselves, are all Black students and other students from historically marginalized groups provided the opportunity, access, and support to thrive and succeed at WashU? How does our commitment to St. Louis, in particular with Black communities, align with our commitment to Black life on campus? How do we honor Black faculty and staff? How do we amplify Black alumni, such as these two friends of mine? So Jason Johnson, who's head of diversity and inclusion for Gen Tech, and Solana Rice, co-founder of Liberation in a Generation. So you talk about wealth disparity, that's what her organization is seeking to eradicate. How do we amplify these Black alumni who are now doing work in equity, diversity, and inclusion, drawing on lessons that they have learned from both WashU and living in St. Louis? So thank you all. I'm sorry I ran over time, and I guess we're ready for discussion. So.
All right, thank you so much to all three presenters. Here's another water. I'm the hydrator. I believe in hydration. All right. So this was amazing. I want to just acknowledge Sarah Murphy in her absence. She really got us together 2-3 times to plan this panel. And so I really appreciate Sarah's efforts and the rest of the Office of Institutional Equity staff and team. I do think we need more community convenings like this, even if they're for a shorter time, just for us to share ideas and get to know each other and get out of our silos, as we were talking about earlier. So I do have a few questions for our panel here. So thank you so much, Ria, for your presentation. Those are the moments that make me embarrassed to be an anthropologist, right? Because our disciplines are implicated in these histories of violence, colonialism, imperialism. So, our fields often are complicated and problematic. It also, in thinking about Brookings Hall, which is where my office is, in South Brookings, I think that's such a symbol, if we think about it, of entanglements, to use Geoff's term, with imperialism and colonialism in terms of our own institutional history. So I just really appreciate these powerful presentations. My first question is, what do these histories mean for the present and future of WashU as an anchor institution in St. Louis? And I'll just open it up to the panel.
Well, I can start just by saying, I think one way to sort of summarize some of this backstory is that our institution, like just about every higher education institution and other kinds of institutions, is implicated in the institutionalization of racism across just about every field of endeavor. We have the university has, through its, selective investments, selective engagement with issues and so forth, selective admissions, differential compensation and all kinds of things, setting aside just, the vast array of intellectual areas that have been engaged. We have played a part in 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 structuring race and ethnic sort of based differentials in terms of access to opportunity, resources, and so forth over many generations. And I think that, I was really glad that we ended with Dr. Purdy's presentation, because it's important also to recognize that that's always been contested, and that also things today aren't the same as they have always been. But there's clearly a lot to do, and I think one of the key things is that I've really encountered, been finding really interesting in my, I guess, 5 years here so far, is building new relationships in this community. I'm involved in a lot of initiatives, and in about half of them, my WashU affiliation is a door opener, and the other half is a door closer.
Yep.
And it's, and it's understandable. This is the story of estrangement I was talking about. And so it's easy for us and for our students to sort of just, not confront that and just sort of stay in our, in our academic bubble. But I think and this is happening across so many fields, so I realize that, but I think we have to build different kinds of relationships rooted in respect, but also in truth-telling and bearing witness, And so I think that's a big part of why these events are important, but also initiatives that are happening, like the Washington Slavery Project.
Everything Geoff said. What I can add is just through my lens in the office where I sit, which is the Office of Marketing and Communications. Shout out to my colleagues in Marcom. But we're telling stories every day. The last time I checked this morning, there are over 26,000 stories published in the source. So I think in terms of opportunities or invitations, there's in my own personal story, is how stories shape the future. And we can be looking at those stories, not just from the perspective of promoting our achievements and our discoveries, but what values are they representing, or what are we promoting and raising up and making visible? What does that say about what is important, and what and who is important to us, and who we are in the world? So that's what I would add.
Well, the thing about Chimamanda Adichie's powerful YouTube, Danger of Single Story, and we can't fall prey to creating a single story of WashU, right? And if I had more time, one could also talk about, while the students were protesting in 2014, they were also having to show the administration the negative comments that they received on social media, to show the administration that discrimination and racism is alive and well at WashU, right? And sometimes students will ask, well, do you think you experienced racism? And I said, I didn't live with social media in college, right? We had a crew, oftentimes when we did sessions like this, it was we kept trying to figure out, well, how do we get other students who don't always come to this? I mean, what you show up to is indicative of what you're engaging in and the stories that you want to engage in, right? And so I think one of the things I try to do with my work, especially with K through 12 private schools, is push them on what are the institutional histories that you are willing to publicly acknowledge and grapple with in all of their fullness and all of their complexities, whether it's negative or positive, right? Because none of what's been achieved has been without pushback in multiple ways. So how do we amplify these stories?
Thank you, Michelle, and I appreciate that chronology, the chronology that you shared. I would like a copy of it. And student activism has always pushed institutions
Yep.
forward, right?
Yep.
And we have to, pay homage and give credit to the students who continue to push us forward. I think, and also I think the urban program is particularly important in terms of WashU's history, and I know you've been deeply involved with that. I want to see us also elevate that program and make sure we continue to support it, even as we bring in students as diverse backgrounds.
Right.
Because the urban program creates a sense of community that anchors students here and makes their experience just so much better and richer. Okay, next question. So given the complicated here that's rooted in various forms of both cultural and institutional oppression, where do we go next? Just a minor question. Oh, advance the slides? Yes, certainly. So given the complicated here that's rooted in various forms of both cultural and institutional oppression, where do we go next?
Want me to start, or you want to start?
Well, it's interesting about student activism. I don't know if this was on the slide or not. I was showing that picture from the student movement, white students mobilizing in the 1950s, students for the Committee for the Admission of African Americans. That wasn't the exact name, but use modern terminology. But that mobilization came something like 80 years after apparently white students had mobilized to exclude Black students. I think in the 1880s, one story about why WashU stopped admitting Black students is that white students protested that it degraded the value of their education. It was, they were sort of thirsty for more distinction, and they thought this was inconsistent with being in an institution that admitted that served Black students was inconsistent. So student mobilization, and we see it now with white nationalism and so forth, and on campuses, and it's not a given that student mobilization will be progressive, though it is a major thrust. I think where we go next, I have a hard time even thinking about the next, and I know that we're here next, but I have a hard time thinking about it because I just feel like there's so much work to do around recognizing where we are here, and I think that building more sort of collective memory around and shared understanding of where we are now and how we got here is really crucial to the possibility of a collective future that is marked by things like equality of opportunity, equal protection, those sorts of things. We're just wrapping up this semester. This year, we've been teaching a studio lab, a public humanities lab called Memory for the Future, which is really asking, what are the memories we need for the future we want, as relates to these histories of systematic violence. So I think it's important to sit with the here as a kind of mechanism for sort of setting the stage for what can come next. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that one reason we, when I pitched that to the chancellor that we join universities studying slavery, a primary argument I made was that the nature of the university is such that most students will never encounter these kinds of questions, will never spend time reflecting on the racial history of this institution, because to do so you would typically have to select into the 1 or 2 classes where you would encounter that, or go to that one-off event. And we're just, and it's just not likely to happen for most students. So one of the arguments was that we could create more opportunities for encounters with these questions, not only for our students, but with faculty, with staff, with community stakeholders, by engaging in this institutional initiative. And I think that's an important part of the contextualization of the here that I think will hopefully help us collectively visualize and achieve a more positive future.
Did you have any comments or?
Oh, I
should
was going
move
to
on?
say, that is a really complicated question. I don't know about the where, but I do have some thoughts on the how. You know, I come from a country with over 7,000 islands, over 100 languages. And I think that part of American occupation was language suppression. I think this morning someone mentioned this idea of language. I don't know who it was because I was online, so the people were really tiny. But someone said something about language being equal to mental representations, right? So I feel like the how has to create space for multiple voices or multiple approaches to the issues at hand. You know, that my coworkers know I am like all for getting things done quickly, but sometimes that doesn't yield the most promising and the most rich solutions. As I keep thinking back to, if American English had not been imposed, you know, what kind of richness could I have personally with access to different mental constructions? So that's what I would add to that.
I
Thank
think just quickly, I just think about conversations we had in the educational studies capstone class this semester, with our theme being the promise of educational research for equitable policies and practices. And this is a educational research tradition, and in the dominant narrative rooted in negative ways in which the othered has been researched and analyzed, and then therefore how policies and practices have been applied. And towards the end of this semester, including this week, our students were grappling with, what does it mean to do equity work? And earlier this morning, Veta and others talked about it being, it's every day, it's intentional. And so how do we prepare students? How do we prepare ourselves to be doing and I like what Dr. G said, you know, adding justice, obviously, but justice, equity, diversity, inclusion work. How do we prepare students to do this every day? How do we get them to understand what it means to engage this work, to understand that there are multiple ways in which people are approaching this work, and how they will find their footing? Not only to help us think about how to make WashU a better place, but in all the ways in which they will take their WashU education and try to make other institutions, communities, et cetera, more just, more fair, more equitable.
Thank you. I'm going to skip over our last question because we want to give you a chance to get back into your groups from earlier or pair up with new people if someone has left, and just talk about your WashU story. How did you get here? And also any connections you can make in your groups to things that resonated with you from the panel would be great. We'll do that until 2:45, and then we actually will have a chance to report out some of the things that you shared that you might want to just kind of share with our larger group here today. Okay, so we're going to talk about how did you get here and any connections you made with things that were said on the panel until 2:45, so 6 more minutes. Okay, we're going to open it up for your thoughts on what you've shared. So, you know, if you have your group members' permission, you can share what they've said, but otherwise, we'll ask that you speak for yourself in terms of what you've shared. And for folks who are streaming, we hope you also had a chance to reflect on how you got here. So Marina has the mic if anyone would like to share out anything, reflections also just in general in terms of our session just now from the panel. Yes, so any comments, reflections from our audience members? There's one way down here.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Ariel Williams. I work in the Center for Diversity and Inclusion, and I actually know 2/3 of this panel, so hi. So I actually had just a reflection of what was presented. So number one, I've been at the institution for almost 3 years, and I did not know all of this. I've only known parts of this information. So I really appreciate the session, actually, and I currently serve as the president for the Black Faculty and Staff Cabinet. And one of the things that I think would be really cool is to invite this conversation into that space, because I think that there are obviously more Black faculty and staff who probably don't know the history or the context in which we work every day, and the students that we're serving, or just our experiences as contributors to this space. So this was just really a lot of information, honestly, and so I'm just reflecting and trying to process all of what was just provided, but I really appreciate the flow of the information as well. And I'm just overwhelmed, if I'm being honest. But I just know that this needs to be shared more on a like you were saying, on a more regular basis, because we have new people coming in every day to the institution, folks who might be alumni, folks who are coming from all over the country, and have no idea the contextual history of this institution. And one of the things I was sharing with my group earlier in the first conversation is that there are spaces, names, titles, monuments on this campus that reinforce some of these systemic issues. And I don't know if anyone is thinking about that or trying to undo some of those things. And so in my work, we talk about this on a regular basis, but we're a small team. So I don't know if we can, dismantle a lot of this stuff too. But I just think that as a institution, we have to do more than just talk about it. Like, I appreciate the first part of this is conversation, obviously, and acknowledgement. But now we have to do the work. So I just really would love to see what happens in the next. Lord, it just worked that way.
Thank you, Ariel. In response to one thing that you mentioned, there is a new commission that the chancellor has formed on remembrance and commemoration for the university. So I know that Will and I, and maybe some other folks here, are on that, and we'll be making recommendations about how we remember university history and who we're remembering and those kinds of issues. Yeah. I think there's another. Yes.
I have 2 questions, and they both reside with legislation that was just passed and may possibly pass. But the first one is the Do Not Harm Act that was just passed in Missouri, in regarding diversity, inclusion, and that is basically it can't be implemented anymore in regard to state funding. And the second one would be the 2 court cases happening, one against Yale and the other one I forgot about, in regard to affirmative action. I wanted to hear your takes on both, and if you know about the first one even, because the first one will be effective in August of 2023, and the second one I'm sure you guys have heard about.
Does anyone have thoughts on those 2 items?
Well, I think the first one, I was just thinking about this in relation to the last prompt about the given where we are, what's next, and this legislative efforts are, these sort of suppressive legislative measures around critical thought are indicative of an unwillingness to come to terms with where we are and how we've gotten here, and in a sort of inability, not an inability, but an unwillingness to sit with difficult truth and to kind of work through, as I was talking about earlier, the historical trauma to even acknowledge that there's something that we need to deal with. I sometimes wear rose-colored glasses, and I think that those measures are in some ways reflective of the progress that we've made in this nation in terms of narrative change. I don't think the Mayflower is coming back as the center of the sort of story of America's founding. I think the 1619 Project, similar projects have really upended some of the kind of mythology around our nation's history. And while these legislative measures will be quite damaging and I work with local educators there's a group in St. Louis called Challenging History. It's a collaboration between national parks and museums and local schools that's really focused on supporting teachers in this hostile environment. I know that there are challenges, but I also am optimistic that you can't suppress thought, and it's never actually been possible, and so I think it would be difficult, particularly at public institutions and so forth. But I'm optimistic that we will find ways to continue to have these dialogues and reckonings with these issues.
Yeah, to Jeff's point, I think there are a lot of K through 12 teachers who are wrestling with this and trying to, I think they're more than what we realize who don't approve of the legislation, the state legislation, in all parts of the state. I have a dear friend, my friend Kiana, who has done professional development sessions with history teachers as well. And she's like, you would be surprised she said it would probably be surprising to people, the teachers that she's worked with and where they're from in Missouri in terms of kind of their progressive way of wanting to take on US history. And so I think that's a good spin on it, Geoff. I hadn't quite thought about it like that.
I can lend you my glasses.
Yeah, that's a good spin on it. Obviously with affirmative action, right? We have a Supreme Court now that is right-leaning. So I think pretty much everybody is prepared for affirmative action to be completely struck down. And so how that will manifest in terms of, there was a great session in December that the Asian Multicultural Council put on, and they had Sally Chin here, Marie Bigham, talking about like how this will actually kind of manifest in like college applications, like in terms of will there be any kind of social identity markers that students can discuss, or how do they discuss those things in like their essays. And so it'll be interesting to see kind of how it plays out in the very micro way. But I think most people in higher ed are prepared for it to be, struck down. And the teeth have already been coming out, right? And so with Gratz and Grutter of 2003, it was pretty much upheld that you could use race as part of a whole, as part of a whole kind of look at an applicant, but not on a point system. But then we had those on the right who contested such race-based scholarship programs as Irvin, or programs like Mellon, and ultimately institutions like WashU. And WashU held out for a very long time, but ultimately felt like given the conservative at that time national landscape, that going to court would risk, remember, we get a lot of federal funding, so it would jeopardize that potential, federal funding. So now those programs, we try to keep them anchored in their histories and their commitments to the communities for which they were established. So.
Thank you, Michelle and Geoff. And I think that this will be a topic we'll need to revisit next year. Also, once we get the Supreme Court decision.
I could be surprised.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for the very powerful panel. This reflection question really hit home for me, and Rhea, especially your presentation. My name's Trish Gomez, and I'm Filipina. My mom was able to immigrate here as a nurse because she spoke English so well. She got here at 16 years old, was maybe paid $2 an hour to be a nursing assistant, and then was able to get her LPN, a licensed practical nurse, after that. And again, a lot of it is because she was forced to speak English so early on. Every single Catholic prayer was in English. Her own wedding invitation, when she got married in the Philippines, was also in English. And then my dad was able to get here. He was here with just one suitcase and his x-rays, which was very curious for me. I was like, wait, what, Dad? But all of that was because the colonization. And my last name being Gomez is also part of a history of Spanish colonization, multiple centuries of that. So if you see a Filipino and you're wondering why does their last name sound Spanish, it's that true history of how did we get here, what were those systems and things that literally changed the lives of people. Thank you for the ripple effect analogy too. It's all a ripple effect, and how I got here is because of all those things. So I appreciate it.
And let's thank Trish for her work on
right.
today's event.
Yes, thank you, Trish. Okay, yes, looks like another comment or reflection, or maybe question.
Hi, I'm Deirdre Lockett again. So I really love this panel. It was kind of triggering for me. I'm St. Louis born and raised. I've literally been trying to get to WashU for going on 30 years. From when I graduated high school in 95, so when you were talking about 97, I'm just like, I should have been here. I was supposed to be here. Like 2 people I graduated with were, you know. I've applied for multiple jobs here. I just, including this same job, at least once, but I think twice. I finally got it 5 months ago, so I'm like, I'm finally in the door. And then just hearing all this stuff, like I went to the only Black Catholic high school on this side of the river, and we never saw WashU. We put out, you know, doctors and lawyers and Wall Street people and just all kinds of things. And I participated in the Urban Scholarship Program, but you know, those were exceptional people. And you know, it was only 2 spots. There was no way. It was like 100 of us. There was no way. You know what I mean? And so I couldn't afford to go. But I'm finally here. So now I'm like, I'm gonna, you know, try to do my degree. But a lot of the stuff that you guys are talking about on the panel, and then even earlier this morning, it was stuff that I was saying in the breakout parts. And it was stuff that I've always wanted to do, and just like, you know, get in within the community, and how, you know, WashU has always felt like an ivory tower. And even now that I'm here, I still feel like beneath or something like that. You know what I mean? Like I am. So anyway, this is just very inspirational, and I'm so glad you had this. And I participated in for Olin, a Black faculty, staff, and student. It was like an EDI thing too. And it's making me hopeful. Like maybe I do have a place here, and even though it's been a long time coming, like I can finally, you know, have my affiliation with WashU and have it help my community as well. So.
Thank you. All right, is there a final remark or reflection at all from our panelists? Hosts out?
I just want to thank the organizers. Thank you, Kia, fellow panelists, for inviting me to participate in this and for hosting this conversation on our campus. It's very important.
Yeah, thank you. Same, thank you. I'm so happy to be here, especially representing staff.
Yep.
Thank you for everything that you do to keep this place running.
Yes.
Yes, thank you to our staff. And Michelle, I don't want
Just continue. Thank you for everybody who came out this afternoon, and let's keep the conversations going.
Absolutely, and we don't want it to take 30 years for people to get to WashU. We want to be more open and welcoming, and you know, we want you to feel that you have a place here. So
Definitely.
feel free to reach out to me as well, because you know, we'll only advance as an institution when we are all included and we can all thrive. So on that note, thank you so much for your participation and your attention for this 2-hour session. And I'm going to turn it back over to our MCs. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for those powerful, incredible, and rich history and conversation. I know I've learned a lot. I knew some of it, but not everything. So thank you. Thank you for that. We will transition now to a break. Be back by 3:10. I don't know if there's coffee outside. I haven't checked, but if there's not, don't blame me because I was not in charge of that. And at 3:30, we will welcome a student performance. So I'll see you back here at 3:10. Sorry, 3:10. I misspoke that. 3:10. See you in 10 minutes, essentially.
Okay. Oh. Hello, everyone. My name is Noelle,
And I'm Paula.
and we are the co-vice presidents of PUSO, Philippine United Student Organization, formerly known as FCC Filipino Culture Club. Today, we will be performing tinikling. This is a traditional Filipino dance that involves jumping between bamboo sticks.
Tinikling gets its name from the tickling bird, whose slit-like legs jump over branches and between bird traps set down by farmers. Today, we will be performing tinikling to a portion of the traditional tinikling dance song. All of the dancers are members of PUSO, and we are really excited to show you what we've been working on. Thank you so much.